Imagine a local town sheriff, right? He just crosses his arms, looks squarely at the United States federal government, and basically says, no, I'm just not going to enforce your law.
Right, which sounds crazy on paper.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because on paper, the federal government has absolute supremacy. I mean, they have the funding, the constitutional weight, the ultimate authority. So where exactly does a local official get the power to just opt out?
And what happens to the entire system when they actually do it? Because you end up with this massive structural collision.
Yeah, you really
You start to realize that the whole federal apparatus is, well, it's heavily dependent on local cooperation. Like, without the people on the ground actually turning the gears, federal supremacy can sometimes be, a little more than a suggestion.
It's wild to think about. So today on the Deep Dive, we're looking at a highly unusual source that attempts to map out exactly how that local resistance works. We aren't working from some dense 500-page historical biography today.
No polished academic journals for us this time.
Right. We are actually looking at a digital breadcrumb trail. We have an excerpt from a document, sure, but our real focus for you today is the metadata, the title, and the actual digital location of that file.
It's essentially digital forensics. We're analyzing the literal workspace of an author, a user named Mackenzie, who is using their hard drive to build this framework for understanding power.
The file path is incredibly specific. I'm just going to read it out. It goes users, then to Ewan Mackenzie, to documents, to Claude, to projects, and then to a root folder called explaining history.
Which is quite the title.
Right. Then to a subfolder called homemade sovereignty, landing finally on a file named homemade sovereignty ep3 prints dossier.md.
It's a mouthful.
It really is. So today, we are deconstructing the profound concepts embedded in that exact digital architecture. We're going to unpack the historical reality of the Printz case, explore the mechanics of what this author calls homemade sovereignty, and analyze why this tension is serialized.
Yeah, because the way this information is structured, that is the message. By naming this file a dossier and saving it as an MDA markdown file, the author immediately signals a shift in how we're supposed to, consume this history.
Wait, expand on that a bit, because we rarely call everyday documents a dossier. That implies like a spy's manila folder or a detective's murder board with a red string. Why frame a historical project file that way?
Well, combine the heavy investigative weight of a word like dossier with a raw format like a markdown file. Markdown is it's a stripped-down format used by developers to focus purely on structure. No fancy presentation.
Right, just the raw text and code.
Exactly. So you put those together, and you have a living, active investigation. This isn't passive archiving of some dusty textbook. The author is actively interrogating the subject in real time.
Which brings us to the subject itself.
Yeah.
The Printz part of the Printz dossier. To understand this whole file path, we really have to look at the historical bedrock it's referencing, right?
Oh, absolutely. If this dossier is an investigation into grassroots power, the Printz case is ground zero of that collision.
Let's wind the clock back for you guys to the early 1990s. The federal government passes the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act. The core objective is pretty straightforward, just establish a national background check system for firearms purchases.
Right, but the logistical problem was that the National Instant Check System, well, it didn't exist yet. The federal government had the law, but they just didn't have the digital infrastructure to execute it instantly.
Yeah, computers just weren't there yet.
Exactly. So Congress wrote this interim provision into the Brady Act. They essentially drafted local law enforcement. They mandated that the chief law enforcement officer in any given local jurisdiction had to perform these background checks manually.
Until the federal system was actually up and running.
Right. Congress effectively treated local county sheriffs as federal employees. They outsourced the administrative labor.
And that is exactly where the collision happens. Enter Jay Printz, the sheriff of Ravalli County, Montana, and Richard Mack, a sheriff from Arizona. They looked at this federal mandate and just straight up refused to comply.
Yeah, they basically said, absolutely not.
They argued that the federal government does not have the constitutional authority to conscript state or local officials to enforce a federal regulatory program. They work for the voters of their counties, right? Not for Washington, D.C.
Exactly their argument.
But wait, I have to push back here. If we look at the supremacy clause of the Constitution, federal law supersedes state law. Like, if Congress passes a law, how can a county sheriff just decide they don't want to participate?
It sounds like a violation of the basic hierarchy, right?
Yeah. I mean, if local officials can just veto federal mandates whenever they feel like it, the entire system would just collapse into anarchy.
Well, the nuance here is crucial, and it's the absolute foundation of the Supreme Court's eventual 5-4 ruling in Printz v. United States. This was authored by Justice Antonin Scalia.
Okay, so what was his logic?
So Scalia's majority opinion didn't say the federal law itself was unconstitutional. The federal government is perfectly within its rights to require background checks.
Right.
What they cannot do is force state officials to do the work for them. It's a doctrine known as anti-commandeering.
Oh, okay, so the federal government can enforce the Brady Act all they want, but they have to physically send their own federal agents to Montana to do it.
Precisely. Scalia argued that the Constitution establishes a system of dual sovereignty. The states are not just mere administrative subdivisions of the federal government. They are sovereign entities in their own right.
Because conscripting local sheriffs kind of blurs the lines of political accountability, right?
Exactly. If Sheriff Printz is forced to enforce a federal law that his local constituents hate, the constituents will blame Printz. They won't blame Congress.
Right, because he's the guy at the desk telling them no.
Exactly. So the anti-commandeering doctrine basically ensures that if the federal government wants to enforce a controversial program, they have to bear the political cost and provide the manpower themselves.
And that manpower requirement is the massive vulnerability in the whole federal system. I mean, the federal government simply does not have enough agents to enforce every single federal law across all 50 states without local help.
They just don't. It absolutely requires the cooperation of the local sheriffs, the local police, the state administrators.
And if that local cooperation is withdrawn, the federal government is functionally paralyzed in that specific area, which is the exact mechanism that our author in Mackenzie is analyzing in this file path. The file literally sits in a folder called homemade sovereignty.
Yeah, let's analyze that phrase because it really is a brilliant oxymoron.
It is. We typically associate sovereignty with like ultimate top-down power. You know, crowns, constitutions, massive centralized authority.
Right, big armies and federal buildings.
Yeah, but homemade implies DIY, crafting, building something from scratch in your garage. Sovereignty implies absolute control, while homemade implies localized grassroots action.
And the tension in those two words describes the exact legal loophole created by the Printz decision. Homemade sovereignty isn't about local governments, like officially rewriting the U.S. Constitution.
Right, they aren't seceding from the Union.
No, not at all. It's about local governments carving out functional zones of autonomy through strategic inaction. By simply refusing to participate, local communities construct their own pockets of authority.
It's honestly like setting up a local mesh Wi-Fi network that deliberately ignores the main internet service provider.
Right.
Like the local nodes aren't actively destroying the main ISP's infrastructure, they just refuse to route its traffic.
That's a great analogy.
Right. And if enough local nodes opt out, the main network signal just can't penetrate the neighborhood. The local network functions on its own rules within its own boundaries.
That is the perfect mechanical description of anti-commandeering. The local sheriff isn't out there arresting federal agents. They're just withholding their labor. And because the federal government lacks the resources to cover the gap, that local area achieves a form of homemade sovereignty.
The local rules become the de facto law of the land, regardless of what Washington says.
Exactly.
So if you were breaking this down for, say, a college student cramming for a political science exam, what is the core takeaway of this dynamic? How do you summarize this tension between the federal mandate and the local refusal?
The summary is basically this. Federal supremacy is a legal reality, but it's an administrative illusion.
Oh, I like that. Legal reality, administrative illusion.
Right. The federal government can legally dictate policy, but they are operationally dependent on the states to actually execute it. The Printz case weaponized that operational dependence.
It gave states the constitutional right to cross their arms and say, do it yourself.
Exactly. And because the federal government often literally can't do it themselves, the state effectively nullifies the law within its borders.
Which naturally leads us to the next structural clue in the metadata, the EP3 tag in the file name. Homemade sovereignty, EP3 Printz dossier.
The serialization is key here.
Right, calling this Episode 3 indicates that the Printz case is not just a historical anomaly. It's part of a series. The author views this tension as a recurring, deeply ingrained feature of our political system.
By categorizing this as a case study and serializing it, the author is showing us that homemade sovereignty is a tool, and it's constantly being picked up and used by different actors for entirely different reasons across different eras.
Printz was a pivotal moment in the 90s concerning firearms, sure.
But the legal architecture established there has become the blueprint for modern state resistance across the entire political spectrum.
Yeah. And we see this exact dynamic playing out right now with modern loopholes and workarounds. Let's look at how this anti-commandeering principle is weaponized today. Like immigration and sanctuary cities operate on the exact same legal framework established by Printz.
It is the identical mechanism. I mean, the federal government has supreme authority over immigration law. They mandate the detention and deportation of undocumented individuals. However, relying on the Printz precedent, numerous cities and states have declared themselves sanctuaries. They explicitly forbid their local police officers from cooperating with federal ICE agents.
So they won't hold individuals in local jails for federal pickup.
Exactly, and they won't share local databases either.
The local mayor is basically playing the role of Sheriff Printz. They aren't actively fighting the federal agents in the streets. They're just saying, we won't use our local tax dollars or our local personnel to enforce your federal policy. If you wanted to deport someone, send your own federal agents.
And because ICE doesn't have the manpower to patrol every street corner without local police assistance, the federal immigration policy is effectively neutralized in those cities.
The city has achieved homemade sovereignty over its local immigration policy simply through strategic inaction.
Right, but it doesn't stop there.
No, it doesn't. The serialization of this concept, moving from an episode on firearms to an episode on immigration, it really shows how asymmetric and politically neutral the tool actually is. We see the exact same thing happening with cannabis legalization.
Oh, cannabis is perhaps the most glaring modern episode of this phenomenon. Under federal law, the Controlled Substances Act classifies cannabis as a Schedule I drug. It is strictly prohibited.
Yet a massive number of states have just legalized it for medical or recreational use anyway.
Exactly.
But how does that actually work in practice? Like, if a federal DEA agent walks into a dispensary in Colorado or California, they can legally shut it down, right?
Yeah.
The federal law hasn't changed.
They absolutely can. The federal law is supreme. But again, we run into the manpower problem. The DEA cannot possibly police the entire state of Colorado without the help of the Colorado State Police and the local sheriffs.
Which they don't have.
Right. The states simply pass laws saying cannabis is legal here and our state police will not arrest anyone for it. They withdrew their enforcement apparatus.
So the federal government is left totally isolated. They have a law on the books, but no boots on the ground to enforce it.
Yep. The state essentially builds a protective bubble of homemade sovereignty around an entire industry.
It's wild. And we even see it looping back to firearms with the rise of Second Amendment sanctuaries, where hundreds of counties across the country have passed resolutions stating they will not enforce state or federal gun control measures that they deem unconstitutional.
Right, using the exact same playbook.
Or look at the explosion of sports betting. States just decide to stop enforcing federal bans, which basically forces the federal government's hand.
The author's use of that AP3 tag captures this reality perfectly. It's a revolving door. One decade, a conservative state uses the Printz precedent to ignore federal gun laws.
And the next decade, a liberal state uses the exact same precedent to ignore federal immigration or drug laws.
Exactly. It is a structural tool that both sides use to nullify policies they disagree with.
It's fascinating because it highlights a massive irony at the heart of the Printz ruling. I mean, the original intent of Scalia's opinion was to protect state sovereignty, to ensure the federal government didn't treat states as just, administrative puppets.
Right, to keep the lanes of power clear.
But in practice, it didn't just protect state boundaries, it handed the states a literal blueprint for actively nullifying federal law. It created a sanctioned method of resistance.
Which brings us back to the root directory of our source material. The folder that houses all of these case studies is titled Explaining History.
Explaining, not just archiving.
Right. The author isn't just archiving Supreme Court summaries for fun. They are actively trying to build a framework to explain how power actually functions in the real world.
Because when you look at history, it's just a massive, overwhelming pile of data names, dates, court rulings. It just looks like noise, doesn't it?
It's just a bunch of random events.
Yeah. But by organizing it into a project called Explaining History, the author is extracting the signal. They are showing us that the chaos of state versus federal conflicts isn't random at all. It follows a very specific architectural logic.
And that architectural logic is vital for anyone trying to navigate modern society. I mean, you interact with these layers of authority constantly. When you vote for a local sheriff, a city council member or a state governor, you are not just electing a mid-level manager.
No, you're electing an official who holds the structural power to either facilitate or completely cripple the federal government's reach into your specific community. But wait, the federal government isn't totally helpless here, right? If states keep using the anti-commandeering doctrine to opt out of federal laws, Washington must have a countermove. They aren't just going to let the entire system fracture into thousands of localized fiefdoms without a fight.
Oh, definitely not. Washington's primary countermove involves the spending clause of the Constitution.
Okay, the power of the purse.
Exactly. If they cannot legally force a state to do something, they will just financially coerce them. The classic example here is the national drinking age.
Oh, right, the whole 21 age limit thing.
Yeah, the federal government couldn't directly mandate a drinking age of 21 across the board, so they tied federal highway funding to it. They told the states, look, you have the sovereign right to set your drinking age to 18 if you want, but if you do, we will withhold millions of dollars in highway maintenance funds.
Wow. So they use the federal wallet to buy the local cooperation they can no longer constitutionally demand?
Exactly. It shifts the entire battlefield from legal commandeering to financial leverage. But, even with the spending clause, the friction remains. States will calculate whether the federal money is actually worth the political cost of compliance.
Right, like if a state is wealthy enough, or if the issue is politically explosive enough, the state might just refuse the money.
And just maintain their homemade sovereignty anyway.
The tension is permanent. It's just baked into the very DNA of the system.
And that is exactly why this single digital file path is such a powerful source. From a string of text ending in .md, we've unpacked the fragility of federal supremacy, the profound leverage of local inaction, and the structural reality of how communities build their own authority.
It's incredible. We've moved from the raw metadata of a developer's workspace into a unified theory of grassroots power.
It fundamentally changes how you look at the rules that govern your daily life. It makes you realize that authority isn't always a monolithic block of marble handed down from a capital city.
Often it's just a messy, ongoing negotiation taking place right in your own neighborhood.
Yeah. So as we close out this deep dive, consider the implications of this digital blueprint in your own experience. The Printz dossier shows us that power is ultimately reliant on the willingness of people to actually execute it.
If local cooperation is the linchpin of federal authority, then the laws you live under are really only as solid as your community's willingness to enforce them.
Right. Think about the official imposing structures you interact with every day, zoning boards, local police, state regulations.
How much of the authority you accept as absolute unbreakable law is actually a rigid top-down mandate? And how much of it is merely a homemade construct, a shared local agreement that your community has simply chosen for now to accept?